Of all the devastations to befall Ireland, none was as relentless or soul-crushing as the Great Potato Famine. It was a disaster that would reshape the island's history and etch deep scars on the hearts of its people. In the fall of 1845, the first signs of catastrophe appeared. An invisible invader, a fungus-like organism known as Phytophthora infestans, began its slow and sinister march across the land. What started as a few rotten potatoes in fields quickly spiraled into a nightmare of biblical proportions. The once vibrant green fields, teeming with life, were now marked by decay, with entire crops turning black, foul, and unrecognizable. The Irish people, most of them tenant farmers, relied almost exclusively on the potato to survive. These were men, women, and children whose very existence hung by a thread, woven into the soil they toiled on, a soil they did not even own. Ruled under the iron grip of British landlords, these farmers worked the land for little more than subsistence. When the potato crops failed in 1845, the impact was immediate and brutal. But it was only the beginning of 7 long, tortuous years of famine. In that first year, half of the potato crop was lost, but the worst was yet to come. By 1846, the plague of rot consumed nearly 3/4 of the harvest, leaving millions of Irish families with nothing but empty plates and hollow bellies. Starvation set in swiftly. Fields once teeming with life were now graveyards of withered plants, the blackened leaves a stark reminder of what had been lost. The air, heavy with the stench of decay, weighed down on the people as their hope slowly crumbled. The British government, though aware of the catastrophe unfolding across the Irish Sea, responded with cold indifference. They imported corn, but it was not nearly enough, and its cost was so high that most could not afford it. This pitiful gesture, far too little and far too late, did nothing to stem the tide of suffering. The Irish people, emaciated and broken, were left to fend for themselves. Entire villages began to vanish as people succumbed to hunger, disease, and despair. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones withered before their eyes, too weak to cry, too tired to even hope for deliverance. It was in the depths of this nightmare, when the world seemed to have turned its back on Ireland, that an unexpected hand reached out across the ocean, one that seemed as improbable as it was profound. In 1847, the Choctaw Nation, a group of Native Americans who themselves had been displaced and brutalized by the United States government just a few years earlier during the infamous Trail of Tears, heard about the suffering in Ireland. The irony was sharp and bitter. The Choctaw people, who had endured one of the most horrific forced relocations in American history, could have turned away from the Irish. They had their own wounds to nurse, their own battles to fight. Yet, something stirred deep within the Choctaw people, a sense of shared suffering, a recognition of a common humanity. Despite their own poverty and the pain still fresh in their hearts from the Trail of Tears, they chose to act. In an extraordinary gesture of compassion, the Choctaw people collected $170, a considerable sum at the time, and sent it to aid the starving people of Ireland. This donation was not just a financial offering, it was a symbol of solidarity, of two peoples bound by a shared history of suffering under the yoke of colonization and injustice. The Choctaw gift might have seemed small to the wealthy nations of the world, but to the Irish, it was a beacon of hope in their darkest hour. The news of this act of kindness spread like wildfire through the Irish countryside, lifting the spirits of a people who had been abandoned by their rulers and left to starve. It was a reminder that even in the worst of times, the bonds of empathy and compassion can transcend oceans, languages, and cultures. As the famine continued to rage, claiming the lives of over 1 million people and forcing another million to flee their homeland, the story of the Choctaws' generosity became part of Ireland's folklore, a tale of unlikely friendship born from shared pain. The Choctaw people, though distant and far removed from the shores of Ireland, became a symbol of the power of human kindness. Their gift was not just a sum of money, it was a lifeline, a message that no matter how cruel the world may be, there are always those willing to stand in solidarity with the oppressed. This bond between the Irish and the Choctaw endures to this day. It is a relationship forged in the fires of suffering, yet tempered by an unbreakable spirit of compassion. In 1990, 150 years after the famine, the Irish people commemorated the Choctaws' act of kindness by erecting a memorial in County Cork, a sculpture of 9 eagle feathers reaching toward the sky. And in 2018, the Irish government provided aid to the Choctaw Nation during the COVID-19 pandemic, paying forward the kindness that had once been shown to them. In a world so often marked by division and conflict, the story of the Irish-Choctaw friendship is a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when we recognize our shared humanity. It teaches us that even in the face of the greatest adversities, kindness can blossom in the unlikeliest of places, and that the seeds of compassion, once sown, can grow into bonds that endure for centuries. From there on, the British government's involvement in alleviating the famine was shockingly minor, almost indifferent to the cries of the Irish people. For many Protestant English, this suffering was seen through a lens of religious judgment. They believed it was God's way of punishing the Catholic Irish, who had long been viewed with disdain and mistrust. Rather than viewing the Irish as victims of a natural disaster, many in England saw them as a people deserving of their fate, a sentiment that fueled apathy and neglect in the face of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. As the Irish population withered from starvation, a bitter irony unfolded. Ireland, a land ravaged by hunger, continued to serve as a vital food exporter for the British Empire. Grain, meat, and other foodstuffs were shipped from Irish ports under the watchful eyes of British soldiers, even as the people of Ireland starved on the docks. It was as if the very lifeblood of the nation was being drained away before their eyes. On one side, there were mountains of food being exported to feed the wealthy tables of Great Britain. On the other side, families huddled in their crumbling cottages, their stomachs aching, watching the ships sail away with what could have saved their lives. The Great Famine had become not just a disaster of nature but one of politics and power. The British government continued to export food from Ireland as though the famine were an inconvenience rather than a national tragedy. To the Irish people, this was not just indifference, it felt like betrayal. With each shipment of food that left their shores, their trust in their rulers shattered further. Hunger gnawed at them, not just physically, but emotionally. It tore at their pride, their hope, and their belief that anyone in power cared for their survival. The potato crops, the very heart of their sustenance, did not fully recover until 1852, 7 long years after the first blight. The toll was staggering. Although estimates vary, it is believed that as many as 1 million Irish souls perished during the famine, men, women, and children, once full of life, now lost to the ravages of hunger and disease. Entire families disappeared, their names fading into history as unmarked graves dotted the countryside. But the dead were not the only ones lost to Ireland. Another 1 million people fled the island, driven by desperation and an instinct to survive. They packed what little they could carry and boarded ships bound for new worlds, many landing in the teeming, unfamiliar cities of North America and Great Britain. Yet even in flight, their suffering did not end. Many emigrants faced brutal conditions on the ships, often called coffin ships, because of the number of passengers who died en route. For those who survived the journey, life in foreign lands was not always the sanctuary they had hoped for. The Irish were often met with hostility, discrimination, and hardship, forced to scratch out a living in the harsh urban landscapes of cities like New York, Boston, and Liverpool. They had left one form of suffering only to encounter another, though at least in these distant lands, they had a chance to rebuild. Within such a hostile environment, both at home and abroad, the Irish felt that they had few friends. They were a people pushed to the brink, both by nature and by the cold calculations of political leaders who seemed to view their suffering as inconsequential. For many Irish, it felt as though the world had turned its back on them. They were abandoned, cast adrift in a sea of despair. The sense of isolation was profound, and it deepened the already existing wounds of colonial oppression that had long been a part of Ireland's relationship with Britain. But amid this ocean of indifference, a flicker of unexpected light appeared. From across the Atlantic, in a land that had itself known suffering, came a gesture that would forever change the course of Irish history. The Choctaw people, thousands of miles away and across cultural divides, recognized the pain of the Irish as their own. This act of compassion, a humble donation, was more than just money. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning people, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human kindness can bridge the greatest divides. The Irish, surrounded by the cruelty of famine and colonialism, had found an ally in one of the most unexpected places, the Choctaw Nation. It was a bond born not of politics or power, but of shared suffering and a recognition that all human life is worth saving. This friendship, forged in a moment of despair, would outlast the famine and stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And yet, 4,000 miles away, across vast oceans and unfamiliar lands, the news of the terrible plight unfolding in Ireland somehow reached the people of the Choctaw Nation. It was as if a distant cry of suffering had echoed across the Atlantic, finding its way to a people who, despite their own pain, would not turn a deaf ear to the agony of others. The Choctaw people had no political ties to Ireland, no economic reason to concern themselves with the fate of those across the sea. But they listened, and they acted. The Choctaw Nation, a proud and resilient community, had lived in the American Southeast for nearly 1,800 years. They were no strangers to hardship. Long before their fateful encounter with the Irish, they had endured their own agonizing struggle for survival. Originally migrating from what is now modern Mexico and Western America, they settled in the lush, fertile lands of the Mississippi River Valley, a region that included parts of present-day Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. For centuries, they thrived there, building a rich culture deeply connected to the earth. Their language, with its roots in the Muskogean family, was a symbol of their deep connection to one another and to the land they had called home for generations. The Choctaw people lived by principles of harmony and balance, and this was reflected in the way they organized their society. At the heart of the Choctaw way of life was a matriarchal structure, a tradition that placed women at the center of tribal life. Though men served in leadership roles, the voice of women was equally important, guiding the tribe with their wisdom, their nurturing, and their strength. In Choctaw society, marriage was not a union of dominance but of collaboration and respect. Men joined their wife's family upon marriage, and status was not conferred by birthright or wealth but earned through acts that benefited the whole tribe. Honor and prestige were achieved not through power or force, but by service and sacrifice, by working for the good of all, rather than the few. This culture of collective responsibility, of elevating the needs of the community above individual ambition, would become a crucial foundation for the compassion they would show to Ireland. The Choctaw had faced their own devastation just a few years before. In the 1830s, they were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the American Southeast during the brutal event now known as the Trail of Tears. Under the orders of the United States government, the Choctaw, along with other Native American tribes, were driven from their homes, marched hundreds of miles to what was then considered the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. Thousands died from exposure, disease, and starvation along the way. They had seen their own people, their elders and children, fall on that long, harrowing journey. For the Choctaw, the Trail of Tears was a wound that had not yet healed. The memory of their suffering was fresh, the pain still raw. They had been stripped of their land, their homes, and much of their way of life, forced to start anew in an unfamiliar and often hostile land. And yet, when they heard of the Irish famine, when they learned that a people an ocean away were starving, the Choctaw understood that pain. They knew, in the deepest parts of their hearts, what it felt like to be abandoned, to have no one to turn to. Their own recent history had taught them the meaning of loss, of struggle, and of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. This was a people who had been ravaged by the cruelty of colonialism, just as the Irish were suffering under the British yoke. The Choctaw knew what it was like to be displaced, to be treated as less than human by those who wielded power. They knew what it felt like to watch their children suffer, to feel helpless as their world crumbled around them. And so, when they heard of the plight of the Irish, they did not hesitate. Despite their own hardships, despite the fact that they had so little to give, the Choctaw people gathered what they could. They raised $170, a sum that may seem small by today's standards, but at the time, it was a considerable amount, especially for a people who had so recently been impoverished by their forced removal. This gift, sent across the sea to aid the starving Irish, was not just an act of charity. It was a statement, a recognition that suffering knows no borders, and that the bonds of humanity stretch far beyond geography, race, or creed. To the Irish, this gesture from the Choctaw was nothing short of miraculous. In a world where they had been abandoned by their rulers, where even their neighbors looked at them with pity or disdain, here was a people thousands of miles away, a people who had themselves endured unimaginable suffering, reaching out to help. It was an act that defied logic and expectation. How could a people who had so little, who had themselves been so wronged, be so generous? The answer lay in the Choctaw spirit. It was a spirit that understood, more than most, the value of compassion in times of great need. Their history had taught them that in the face of oppression, the greatest weapon is not violence or hatred, but kindness and solidarity. And so they gave, not because they had much to offer, but because they understood that the Irish needed it more. The $170 that the Choctaw sent was more than just money, it was hope. It was a reminder to the Irish that they were not alone, that even in the darkest of times, there were still people in the world who cared. It was a message that transcended all the barriers of distance, language, and culture. We see your pain, and we will help you bear it. This act of generosity would cement a bond between the Irish and the Choctaw, a bond that has endured for generations. The Choctaws' gift to Ireland was more than an act of charity, it was a declaration of shared humanity. And in a world where so often the powerful ignore the suffering of the weak, it stands as a timeless reminder that true strength lies not in wealth or domination, but in compassion and empathy. The Choctaw people were not merely survivors of the land, they were masters of it. Their livelihood was deeply tied to the rhythms of nature, living off both agriculture and the hunt. For centuries, they thrived on a delicate balance between cultivating the fertile soil of the Mississippi River Valley and gathering what the wilds provided. This symbiosis with the earth shaped their culture, but their skills extended beyond mere survival. The Mississippi Choctaws had developed a keen sense for trade, a tradition of doing business that was as much a part of their identity as their ancient stories. As early as 1700, their economy had blossomed into a powerful engine fueled by both agriculture and commerce. Their land, vast and rich, produced crops that fed their people, but they also harvested something else, opportunity. With crops, goods, and livestock, the Choctaws built relationships with the European settlers who were beginning to encroach upon their territory. The Europeans, wide-eyed and ambitious, were venturing into the Choctaw lands, seeking alliances and resources. The Choctaw, always shrewd and calculating, saw this as a chance to not only secure their place in this changing world but to thrive. Their farming, already well established, became the backbone of a flourishing trade network. They traded with the Europeans, exchanging goods and livestock for tools, weapons, and other resources that could strengthen their society. The Choctaw were no mere pawns in this new world, they were key players, leveraging their position with great skill. Their trade networks extended beyond their dealings with Europeans. For centuries, the Choctaw had established trade relationships with other southeastern tribes, long before the white settlers had ever set foot on their lands. This network was crucial for the movement of goods, ideas, and influence. It was more than just commerce, it was a sign of the Choctaws' sophistication and strategic thinking. Prosperity flowed through their land, and with it came power. But prosperity did not come without conflict. The Choctaws' relationship with neighboring tribes was marked by periods of intense rivalry and war. To the north, the Chickasaw tribe stood as a formidable enemy, while to the west, the Creek tribe eyed Choctaw territory with equal ambition. These tribes were not simply trading partners or rivals, they were adversaries in a constant struggle for dominance. Throughout the 18th century, these conflicts often erupted into bloody raids. The warriors of the Choctaw and their enemies would sweep through each other's territories, burning villages and capturing the defeated. The captives from these wars were not just prisoners of battle, they were taken as slaves, forced into labor to serve the victors. This brutal practice was a harsh reality of life during this time, where power was often measured by one's ability to dominate their neighbors. The Choctaw, fierce and proud, fought bitterly to protect their lands, but they also sought to expand their influence, raiding their enemies and taking captives for themselves. In 1747, however, the Choctaw found themselves divided not by an external enemy, but by internal strife. Civil war erupted within the tribe, splintering it into two factions, the Western Division and the Eastern Division. This rift, which cut deep into the heart of the Choctaw people, was fueled by differing visions for the future. Tensions over leadership, territory, and alliances boiled over, leading to a bloody conflict that would shake the foundations of the tribe. The Civil War tore at the very fabric of Choctaw society, as families and communities were forced to choose sides in the struggle. The once united Choctaw Nation, which had stood strong against external threats, now found itself battling within. The Western Division sought new alliances and trade opportunities with the French, while the Eastern Division leaned toward aligning with the British. This division wasn't just about politics, it was about the survival and future of the Choctaw people. Each side believed it held the key to ensuring the prosperity of the tribe in a world where European powers were increasingly encroaching on their territory. As the conflict raged on, the Choctaw continued to manage their trade networks and maintain their economy. Despite the war tearing at their internal unity, they knew that their future depended on maintaining their relationships with the European settlers and other tribes. This was a time of great upheaval, but the Choctaw, resilient and resourceful, managed to navigate the storm. Their warriors might have been fighting on opposite sides of the Civil War, but their leaders still understood the importance of diplomacy and trade. When the dust finally settled, the Choctaw had endured yet another trial of survival. The Civil War had left scars, but their society remained intact, with both divisions continuing to engage in trade and diplomacy. The divisions within the tribe did not destroy the Choctaw spirit, and the lessons learned during this time of internal conflict would help them face the even greater challenges that lay ahead, challenges that would come not from other tribes or internal divisions, but from an ever-expanding colonial world that sought to crush them under its weight. This resilient spirit of the Choctaw, forged through centuries of conflict, diplomacy, and survival, would later shape their response to the suffering of the Irish people during the Great Potato Famine. Despite their own internal struggles and the devastation they faced from the Trail of Tears, the Choctaw knew that survival was not merely about enduring one's own hardships. It was about helping others endure theirs. And so, with a history shaped by conflict and compassion, the Choctaw extended their hand across the ocean to offer the Irish people a gift of hope. The rift within the Choctaw Nation that had simmered beneath the surface finally erupted into open conflict, dividing the tribe into two bitter factions, the Western Division and the Eastern Division. What had once been a unified people, driven by a shared vision of prosperity, was now split along lines of politics, trade, and loyalty to foreign powers. At the heart of the conflict was a deep disagreement over trade and alliances. The Western Division, seeing the rise of British influence and the potential benefits of aligning with this new power, pushed to forge stronger ties with the British. They believed that the wealth and power of Britain could secure the future of the Choctaw people, providing them with the weapons and goods needed to maintain their dominance over their rivals. In their eyes, aligning with Britain was not just a matter of commerce. It was a matter of survival in a rapidly changing world. But the Eastern Division would hear none of it. They were loyal to their long-standing allies, the French, who had supported them for decades. The French had not only provided goods and weapons but had also built deep relationships of trust with the Eastern Choctaw leaders. For them, breaking ties with the French to court the British was unthinkable, a betrayal of the bonds they had forged. The Eastern Division wanted no part of the British, whom they viewed as an invasive and manipulative force, encroaching on their lands and traditions. The division within the Choctaw tribe was not merely philosophical, it was strategic. The Western Division sought new alliances with neighboring tribes, particularly the Choctaw and the formidable Chickasaw, who had long been enemies of the Eastern Choctaw. Backed by their British allies, the Western Division was armed and ready for war. Across the divide, the Eastern Division found support from their old friends, the French, who had no intention of losing their influence over the Choctaw. They too supplied the Eastern warriors with weapons and supplies, ensuring they would not be outmatched in the coming conflict. And so the two sides, once brothers in arms, now stood ready to destroy one another. The Choctaw Civil War raged, tearing through the land like a wildfire. What had begun as a disagreement over trade spiraled into a brutal and bloody conflict, as both sides, emboldened by their European allies, clashed in battles that left the land soaked with the blood of their own people. The once peaceful villages of the Mississippi River Valley became battlegrounds, as warriors from the Western and Eastern divisions raided each other's lands, destroying crops, burning homes, and capturing those unfortunate enough to fall into their hands. The war, which would rage until 1750, was a devastating conflict. The Choctaw, once one of the most powerful tribes in the region, found themselves weakened by internal strife. Over 1,000 Choctaws perished in the fighting, their bodies lying in fields that had once been used for planting crops and feeding families. But the dead were not the only casualties. Hundreds more were captured and enslaved, taken as war captives by rival tribes or sold to European settlers. These captives, who once walked freely on Choctaw lands, were now reduced to laborers, their fates sealed by the cruelty of war. For years the war dragged on, with neither side willing to give in. But the conflict could not last forever. The Eastern Division, bolstered by their French allies and their fierce determination to protect their way of life, ultimately emerged victorious. The Western Division, though once formidable, was unable to maintain its alliances and fell into disarray as defeat loomed. The British, seeing the tide turn against their allies, withdrew their support, leaving the Western Division vulnerable and isolated. With the war over, the Choctaw people, now scarred and broken by the internal conflict, sought to rebuild. The Eastern Division, having won the war, immediately severed ties with the British, cutting off trade with their former enemies. Instead, they returned to their pre-war trade with the French, hoping to restore the prosperity they had enjoyed before the bloodshed began. But the wounds of the war were not so easily healed. The Choctaw had lost more than lives. They had lost trust in one another, and the sense of unity that had once defined their people was shattered. The toll of the war was staggering. The fighting had left villages in ruins, families torn apart, and a people fractured. Though victorious, the Eastern Division found itself ruling over a nation weakened by years of internal strife. The once thriving trade networks had been disrupted, and the land that had been so fertile was now a battlefield scarred by war. Over 1,000 Choctaws were dead, and the echoes of their loss would linger for generations to come. The Choctaw Civil War was not just a conflict over trade. It was a struggle for the soul of a people. It was a reminder that even the strongest of nations can be torn apart by division, and that the allure of foreign powers can lead to devastation. Though the Eastern Division had won, the Choctaw people had all paid a terrible price. And yet, even in the aftermath of such destruction, the Choctaw would continue to endure, rebuilding their society piece by piece, and finding strength in their shared history, both of suffering and survival. As the United States of America came into being and began its relentless westward expansion, the 19th century brought new pressures that would forever alter the fate of the Choctaw Nation. The booming European demand for cotton transformed the fertile lands of the American Southeast into valuable, coveted territories. Greedy eyes fell upon the rich soil of the Choctaw homelands, where for centuries the Choctaw had farmed, traded, and built their society. But now, those lands became the focus of an aggressive and unrelenting push by American settlers and the government, who sought to expand the cotton empire at any cost. In 1820, under increasing pressure, the Choctaw were forced to make a devastating concession. They ceded 5 million acres of their ancestral land in west-central Mississippi to the United States, a loss that cut deep into the heart of their territory. The signing of the Treaty of Doak's Stand was yet another reminder that the American government's hunger for land was insatiable. But this was only the beginning. The Choctaw knew, even as they watched their land slip away, that more was to come. The tide of expansion was rising, and it would soon sweep them away altogether. By the 1830s, the push for land had grown more violent, more urgent. The United States, driven by its doctrine of manifest destiny, declared that the Native American tribes of the Southeast, including the Choctaw, must leave their homelands and move westward to what was then known as Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. This forced removal, known to history as the Trail of Tears, was one of the darkest chapters in the history of the United States and an open wound in the hearts of the Native American people. At the time of the removal, there were over 19,000 Choctaw living in Mississippi. These were families who had lived on that land for generations, people who were deeply connected to the rivers, forests, and fields of their homeland. But that connection did not matter to the U.S. government. To the American settlers, the Choctaw lands were simply another resource to be exploited, another prize in their expansionist ambitions. From 1831 to 1833, the forced removal began. Over 13,000 Choctaw were uprooted from their homes, stripped of their land, their possessions, and in many cases, their dignity. They were marched westward, on foot, across hundreds of miles of rough and unforgiving terrain, to the unfamiliar and barren lands of the Indian Territory. This forced migration was conducted under horrendous conditions, with little regard for the survival of the Choctaw people. Many were not prepared for the harsh winter or the brutal journey that lay ahead. Hunger, disease, and exposure claimed the lives of thousands along the way. The Choctaw, who had once been a proud and prosperous people, were now reduced to a broken and suffering mass, marching toward an uncertain future. The Trail of Tears, as it would later come to be known, was not just a physical journey, it was a profound spiritual and emotional devastation. The Choctaw were not simply leaving behind their land, they were leaving behind their ancestors, their history, and their way of life. Every step on that trail was a step further away from the identity they had built for centuries. And as they marched, many fell. Mothers watched helplessly as their children succumbed to illness. The elderly, too weak to keep pace, were left behind to die alone. Entire families were wiped out before they ever reached their destination. But even in this darkest of times, the Choctaw showed incredible resilience. Though thousands perished, thousands more survived, enduring unimaginable hardship to reach their new home in Indian Territory. They rebuilt their communities, refusing to let their culture die, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. Yet the scars of the Trail of Tears would never fully heal. It was a trauma passed down through generations, a reminder of the cruelty they had faced and the strength they had shown in surviving it. Not all the Choctaw left. A minority stayed behind in Mississippi, refusing to abandon the land that had been their home for centuries. These Choctaw, though small in number, would become a symbol of defiance and perseverance. They endured continued pressure from the government and settlers, but they held fast, determined to remain on their ancestral land, no matter the cost. As the years passed, the Choctaw's journey of survival continued to intersect with the tumultuous history of the United States. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the Choctaw, along with other members of the so-called five civilized tribes, the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Seminole, found themselves drawn into the conflict. Many Choctaw sided with the Confederacy, seeing an opportunity to regain some semblance of autonomy or, at the very least, protect their interests in a country that had long marginalized and exploited them. They fought alongside Confederate forces, driven by a complex mix of survival, strategic alliances, and the hope that they might secure a better future for their people. But the Civil War, like so many conflicts before it, would ultimately leave the Choctaw facing new challenges. The war ended in defeat for the Confederacy, and with it, any hopes the Choctaw had of regaining control over their fate in the shifting landscape of post-war America. The United States, once again, would dictate the terms of their future. The story of the Choctaw, from their earliest days in the Mississippi Valley to their forced removal and participation in the Civil War, is a testament to the strength and endurance of a people who refused to be erased. They had lost so much, their land, their loved ones, their freedom. But they never lost their identity. Even as they marched through the horrors of the Trail of Tears, even as they faced the brutal realities of war and displacement, the Choctaw carried with them a fierce spirit of survival. And it was that spirit, born of hardship and resilience, that would one day lead them to extend their hand in friendship to the Irish during the Great Potato Famine, offering hope and compassion to another people who knew the bitter taste of suffering. The Choctaw people, like the Irish, knew all too well the devastating consequences of tyranny and oppression. They had lived through the systematic stripping away of their lands, their rights, and their dignity. Their experience under the yoke of unjust governance had left deep scars, and when they heard about the suffering of the Irish during the Great Potato Famine, it was as though they saw shadows of their own past reflected in the distant cries from across the ocean. The agony of being starved, displaced, and abandoned by those in power was not a foreign concept to the Choctaw. It was a pain they had endured themselves just a few short years prior. When news of the Irish famine reached the Choctaw Nation, it struck a deep and resonant chord within the hearts of the people. A group of concerned tribal members quickly rallied together, determined to do something, anything, to help. Though they had little to spare, their empathy for the Irish suffering transcended their own struggles. It was an extraordinary act of solidarity, born out of their shared understanding of what it meant to face a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Despite their recent displacement and poverty, the Choctaw managed to raise $170, a sum that, at the time, was significant, especially for a people who had so recently been devastated by their forced removal during the Trail of Tears. It wasn't just the amount that mattered, it was the intent behind it. The Choctaw, who had known loss and exile, saw in the Irish a kindred spirit, a people who, like them, had been crushed under the weight of colonialism and left to fend for themselves. This donation, sent across the sea to help alleviate the starvation in Ireland, was more than just a financial contribution. It was a lifeline extended in friendship and compassion, a declaration that even in the darkest times, humanity could still shine through. The impact of that gesture would ripple through history. Though separated by thousands of miles and seemingly unrelated cultures, the Choctaw and the Irish were now forever bound by this shared act of empathy. The links between the two peoples, forged in the fires of suffering, continued to grow over the years. The story of the Choctaw's generosity became part of Irish folklore, a reminder of how unexpected friendships can emerge from the most unlikely places. In 1995, more than a century after that remarkable act of kindness, former Irish President Mary Robinson made the journey to Oklahoma to personally thank the Choctaw people. Robinson, who would later go on to serve as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, recognized the significance of this enduring bond. Standing on Choctaw land, she paid tribute to the tribe's selfless act of compassion, acknowledging that the Choctaw, despite their own hardships, had extended a hand to the Irish when the world had turned its back on them. It was a powerful moment, a testament to the enduring strength of this cross-continental friendship. But the story of the Choctaw and the Irish did not end there. In fact, it resurfaced once again during one of the most challenging periods of modern history, the COVID-19 pandemic. As the virus swept across the globe in 2020, wreaking havoc on communities everywhere, the Navajo and Hopi nations in the United States found themselves particularly hard hit. Faced with widespread illness and a lack of resources, these Native American communities launched an urgent appeal for help. And it was here that the memory of the Choctaw's generosity toward the Irish during the famine came rushing back into the collective consciousness of the Irish people. On May 4, 2020, in response to the Navajo-Hopi COVID-19 appeal, countless Irish donors, inspired by the Choctaw's act of kindness from so many years before, reached out in solidarity. In an extraordinary display of compassion, Irish citizens, many of whom were grappling with their own pandemic struggles, donated to the fund in droves, with many leaving messages that specifically recalled the Choctaw's historic generosity during the famine. It was a gesture of reciprocation, a way for the Irish to honor the debt they felt they owed to the Choctaw, and to extend the same hand of friendship that had once been offered to them. The GoFundMe campaign raised over $4.1 million, much of it from Irish donors, to support the Navajo and Hopi communities as they fought against the devastating effects of the pandemic. It was a remarkable moment of global solidarity, a reminder that the bonds forged through compassion and empathy can endure even across centuries. The story of the Choctaw and the Irish, once born out of a shared history of suffering and survival, had now come full circle. The Irish, who had once been the recipients of Choctaw kindness, were now offering their support to another Native American community in their time of need. The bond between the Choctaw and the Irish remains as strong as ever, a testament to the power of empathy, compassion, and shared humanity. Even in the face of the darkest times, these two peoples have shown the world that kindness transcends all boundaries, be they cultural, geographical, or historical. It is a bond that reminds us that, even when the world seems cruel and indifferent, there are always those who will reach out and offer a hand to lift others up.